Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Make Way for Youth podcast. This is episode 4. We will have a conversation with Reverend Godfrey Adera on religion and SRHR. My name is Warindi, and I'm joined by Bertha and Vilda. Together, we make up the regional and global youth panelists for the Make Way program. The Make Way program aims to break down barriers to SRHR by applying an intersectional lens. Bertha and Vilda will briefly say hello to you, and after that, they'll be followed by Adera, who will do his introduction.
Hi everyone, thank you for joining us, and thank you Warindi. This is Vilda Tieno. Thank you.
Thank you, Vilda. Over to you, Bertha.
Thank you, Warindi. Hi everyone, this is Betha. Happy to have you here.
Thank you, ladies, for your introductions. Over to you, Adera. As I mentioned earlier before Adera does his introduction, he's our guest for this podcast today, and we're very excited to have him here. So over to you, Adera, to do your intro.
Thank you so much, Warindi, and thank you to your co-hosts, Beth and Vilda, for having me in this conversation. My name is Godfrey Owino Adera. I prefer to be called Adera. I love my African name, Adera. I am a priest in the Anglican Church of Kenya. I also work for the SACCO, of Concerned African Women Theologians, which is a consortium partner within Make Way. And I work there as a program assistant on issues around SRHR, religion, and culture, and basically looking at how can we utilize religious narrative, religious scripts, religious tradition, religious platforms, but also cultural norms and cultural scripts to enhance all issues around SRHR. And so I come to this podcast with a desire to share what we have been able to do in a religious space and what we think is the vision moving forward. How can we engage religious persons, religious spaces, religious people, or religious organizations to become champions, to become allies in our advocacy work for access to information and services that are SRHR related. So that's how I am here, and I'm glad to share my thoughts on that subject.
What's the fire in your belly, particularly that makes you so passionate about doing SRHR advocacy? And you've already given us a background on what you do in the importance of engaging religious persons in SRHR. So
thank you so much, and that's a good question. And I love the way you phrased it. What is the fire in your stomach? It's a good one. Two things: one that is religious, and another one that is cultural, or something I would call African. Now, the religious aspect, religion in all its forms, in all its facets, promises life in abundance. Life in abundance is not just promised in Christianity. You find life in abundance as a promise in Hinduism, in Islam, in all religions we know. Even African traditional religions promise people wellness, abundance of life. And so from a religious point of view, if we position ourselves as people who are conduits of abundant life, then advocacy for SRHR issues is part of curating abundant life. It is part of enabling abundant life for people of all ages and in all places. And one way of doing that is to support people to have conversations that will allow them have authority to take charge of matters around their sexuality, around their reproductive health, around their health in general. And so in the promise for life in abundance, we have no option but to facilitate, to support, to promote, and to enable people to have that through SRHR advocacy. And so that's the religious side. That's the fire in my stomach, the promise of life in abundance. And the fact that religion has become a barrier to SRHR advocacy and work is a challenge to me, because with that, then their promise for life in abundance is challenged, or there's sort of a contradiction that you promise life in abundance, but some aspect of our humanness that gives us that life in abundance, you oppose and deny it. The second fire, which is African and which is cultural, for lack of a better word, is the fact that being Africans or being Black and being born Black and living in the continent of Africa already puts people in a level that makes them vulnerable to so many things. And one of them, we know that the number of, for example, the number of new infections of HIV is highest in Africa. We know the numbers of teenage pregnancy is highest in Africa. We know the numbers of people who die because of unsafe abortion is highest in Africa. And these are statistics people can find all over the place. And so from an African point of view, and as a Black person who serves in Africa, I need to have the spirit of Ubuntu, that I am because you are, and we can only live together. And so as an African, I am challenged to come to a space where I want to see my sister live. I want to see my brother live. I want to see that small child live. I want to see them live to the fullest. And so Ubuntu spirit, the spirit of belonging to each other and belonging together with each other, is the second fire in my stomach that makes me then come to the arena where we have to make life a possibility, life in abundance, life in its abundance in all facets of it. We must make it a possibility. So without saying so much things, those are the two fires in my stomach.
Definitely a great answer. This is it's making me very nostalgic.
Yes, right.
Classes, right?
Yeah.
Remember classes when I was young. Really takes me back. But
Yeah.
the thing I would definitely want to say is that growing up, I'm a young person now, but when I was an adolescent or when I was, before adolescence, doing my catechism classes and also like going through school, just the conservative language that was used towards sex was, I remember at the time, because I grew up in the village, that the main topics that were being taught to us is how to prevent HIV and AIDS. And I remember that the messaging of the church and also the messaging of the school was that ABC, abstain, be faithful, and then use condoms, if that's the correct acronym. And the position of the church has always been, be faithful, you're supposed to have sex outside of marriage and everything else. So my question to you is, why do you think that the church takes such a conservative, harsh for myself, stance on sexuality and SRHR in particular?
Yeah, good question. And I want to tell you that and to all our listeners and those who listen to this later on, that conservative position has traveled. It is not African. It has traveled, it has come from a place and came to Africa. It came with people, it came with their agenda, it came with their power, it came with their privilege, it came with their aspect of colonizing Africa. And let me take you a little back in history. And some of us who've read a lot of stories that are written from an African perspective, stories that take a decolonial dimension. For example, simple stories like stories of Chinua Achebe, Things Fall Apart. Simple stories like the stories of Ngugi wa Thiong'o, The River Between. You see that the coming of some visitors made things fall apart in Africa. And that is true. Before the coming of the colonizer that traveled either with the 19th century Christianity or that came with commerce through Islam, African languages did not make sex and sex talk a taboo. African languages, African cultures had a very progressive and liberal conception and ideology around the human body, around sexuality, around gender, around sex, around all these things. It is the Victorian language of the colonizer, for example, that came with missionary enterprise in Africa that begins to name African sexuality as deviant, African ways of expressing their bodily forms, expressing it in the ways they did through dance, through music, and through all sorts of things. They begin to declare that deviant. So you see a Victorian language that is used to name African sexuality, African bodies, African ways of knowing, African ways of doing things. And that is also the same with the Islamic presence in Africa that came with commerce and came with subjugation of people. And so the conservative stance that we have been taught in Sunday school, we have been taught in catechism, is what is an African, because it has traveled. And within the spaces I work in, for example, like in the circle, we take a decolonial dimension to SRHR. When I say decolonial, I mean looking at Africa pre-colonization, pre-missionary enterprise, pre-commerce and Islamic invasion, looking at celebration of diversity, looking at celebration of African bodies, both women bodies and male bodies, and all bodies the way they presented. And going back there to find what are some of the aspects that we can retrieve today to support and to frame the way we talk about our bodies, talk about sexuality and various things. And so without saying so many things again, the conservative stance of sexuality has traveled. The conservative stance on SRHR has traveled. The conservative stance on female bodies, wanting female bodies to be controlled in whichever ways they want to be controlled, has traveled. And we need to tell our people that that is not who we are, that is not what we were, and we need to go back there. But not just go back there, but also go there critically. How do we go there? We still find that there were cultures, there were aspects of our lives that still were demeaning. We can do away with that, but take the positive aspects and run with it. And so in my first response, I talked about Christianity coming in and promising life in abundance. I talked about Ubuntu as a framework of looking at SRHR. And now I'm introducing decolonial framing, going back to what is really African, what is root within our cultures that then we can use for our conversation. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, very, very interesting to know the narrative of our conservative stance on sexual and reproductive health and rights traveling. I think that's very interesting. Warindi, Vilda, did you guys know? Yeah, it's a very interesting narrative. Just on that, Reverend Adera, considering the very conservative stance on sexual and reproductive health that we have subscribed to in the African context, I'm curious to know what your stance is on comprehensive sexuality education and what should be our stance on comprehensive sexuality education, of course, having religion in mind and being in the African context, for example.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And also interesting to ask me my personal stance, which I will share. But also let me bring a small background to it. From my own work and my own studies and my own research, I have known that in terms of the way we frame and talk about comprehensive sexuality education, there are three approaches. One approach that is largely found within religious spaces is a value-based approach. Let's talk about our values. Let's talk about abstinence. Let's talk about morality. Then number two is a rights approach or right-based approach. And that we see a lot with many CSOs, with many groups organizing, we see a right-based approach. Then number three, we see a health-based approach, and that also finds a lot of convergence with the right-based approach. Now, my personal stance based on those three approaches is what I would say a harmonization of all those three approaches. Let's talk about a value-based approach that is rooted within our religious and cultural narratives and norms. Let's talk about a rights-based approach that allows people to make decisions, allows people to have conversation, allows people to be taught within spaces like, for example, in school spaces about issues of sexuality and sex and health. And then also let's have a health-based approach where we now talk about statistics showing us that we are not doing so well in many African contexts. In African countries, we are losing people to things that can be prevented if conversations that have been labeled by the colonizer as taboo are brought to the fore. And so my personal stance is both value-based approach, health-based approach, and rights-based approach. And I'm inviting my colleagues within religious spaces to think not just outside the box of value-based approach, but far away from the box and look at the health dimensions to it and look at the rights dimensions to it. At the end of the day, what is important is the promise that we give as religious people, abundant life. And how can that be possible when we talk about comprehensive sexuality education? And so my stance is all those three, very important. Let's harmonize them and make them work for us.
That's a very intelligent response, Vil.
Oh, wow. Thank you so much, Adera. And I'm also picking up that we are not homogeneous being. We are not homogeneous being, and there's need to have alternatives. If what we see is working for us is not working for you, then can we get other alternatives so that we are at par? And then when you're speaking, Adera, something came to my mind when we were learning about the intersectional See, Judge and Act tool that was developed by the SACO, which is a consortium in the Make-Way program. And I remember that conversation when we had Reverend Evans talking about, I'm looking forward to seeing where we have SRHR issues and the Bible on the same table. And then also talking about looking at the issues of sexual reproductive health and rights issues and maybe the Quran or the Bible fixing in the same document and not just now at par on the same table, which when you are speaking was something that I was also trying to reflect with the tool that we have, trying to just address the different issues of SRHR with the context of religion. So back to you, I wanted to ask this question. Now that we are saying that we are talking of statistics and we are talking of these different numbers, but now from the church, do you think there are different roles that the church can play in advancing sexual reproductive health and rights in Africa? And if there are, what do you think are the different roles that the church plays in advancing SRHR for all persons in Africa? Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much for that, and I will respond to that. But just to go briefly and say something which you mentioned about ISJA tool in the section on See, Judge and Act tool that was developed by the SACO that I work for. And what is that tool really? That tool is simply a tool that helps us to engage religious narrative, religious scripts like the Bible and the Quran, religious persons to be in line with the goals and the promises for promoting SRHR. And having said that there is an existing tool, I go back to the question you've asked now. So what is the role that religious leaders or religious spaces should do, and how should that look like? Basically, from an African context, I think, and this may be my own bias as a religious person, but I think Africa, as has been described before in many contexts, is notoriously religious. That our religions are still very present with us every day. Religion is an everyday experience that all Africans have. And so we cannot ignore religion. Based on that fact, therefore, religion or religious spaces or church leaders or leaders in religious spaces have two central roles. Number one, to convene. And number two, to convince. When I say convene, is to let's bring people together. Religious spaces have platforms where people gather. We have lots of people following religious traditions, be it Islam, Christianity, and of course Islam and Christianity are the biggest in Africa, but also in terms of people who follow African religious traditions. religion has the potential to convene people. They can bring people from different social backgrounds, from different status of society, and after convening them, religion can convince people to a particular direction. And so that power to convene, we need to convene and be known not for what we oppose in our convening, but what we promote that will enhance lives in Africa. And that's where SRHR comes up. And so we are able to convene. And I request, as in our convening, let's promote life through SRHR conversations and advocacy. Secondly, the religion has been known to be convincing people. Many people are convinced to do things using religious narratives. The latest one you've all seen from a Kenyan context is religion has convinced people even to quit their jobs, even to die fasting, the Shakahola experience. But can we then think about convincing people towards life, convincing people towards making life a possibility? It's that convincing power can be used to convince people in particular ways. Are we able to convince people, for example, about family planning? We are able to. Are we able to convince people about gender-based violence, that we have a world that is free of GBV? We are capable of doing that. Are we able to convince people to take responsibility of their reproductive health and support them to access information and services that will promote that? We are able to. Only that we want to hide in our cocoon and assume we are guarding some values, that we are guarding and protecting particular spaces. That is dangerous for us based on what I said before, our statistics. Let's use our powers to convene and convince in constructive ways.
Thank you so much. Yes, it does. Warindi Bata, do you have something to add?
We could listen to Reverend Adera the whole day.
I'm
really enjoying the podcast so far, and it's so informative. Yeah, thank you for sharing this with us.
We might need more time to just discuss about this, because I'm getting to learn a lot, and I'm trying also to reflect. Me being a religious person, how many times have I been biased when you talk about religion, and not talking about the way you are teaching us about the role of the religion being that to convince and to convene. And I'm looking at that and looking at the Make Way program and the critical role that the circle is playing in regards to bringing that aspect of religion, and just saying that it's not all about religious people to be against everything, but of course we have people who support the work that we do in line with SRHR. So I know this is because a number of things are working out, and you've tested and you are proving to the world that religion is not all about being on the opposition, as many a times people might think. So I wanted to ask this, maybe if you have alternatives, or which approaches should which approaches should we take in regards to promoting SRHR programs, now that understanding that we are a religious community, we are a religious world, to ensure that we are looking forward to access to sexual reproductive health and right for all, and also in a way that we are embracing the intersectionality approach. Thank you.
Okay. And thank you for that as well. As you were asking the question, I was writing notes to see what to respond to, and it seems like what I wanted to say, you've said that, but it's fine. So I still want to support the intersectional approach, and I want to invite people who are doing programming, people who are doing advocacy, to be more intentional about an intersectional approach. That is what many people are missing. Do you know why I oppose only one thing about a person as a religious person? Is because I do not see other things about them. Is because I am blind to some other aspects within that particular life. For example, let me give an example of a person that could be living with a disability and is female, and maybe also living with HIV, also coming from a poor community. There's a tendency that for me, I would only look at, for example, his disability as a religious person, and that is palatable space for me. I get into that, but I forget aspect of this person is living with HIV. This person is young. This person is a woman or a girl, comes from a poor community. So religious people miss an intersectional framework or lens to look at things. That's why it's easy to make noise with one particular aspect of life. And so I still would want to support strongly an intersectional approach. Number two, I will talk about decolonial approach. And this may seem abstract, and when we say intersectional, it may seem abstract. But how can we bring this to everyday language? How can we bring this to practical usefulness? Decolonial approach would ask the question in a different way. For example, when religious people stand there and say that this thing is funded by Mzungu, this is something pushed by whites, this is an agenda that comes from a Western context. I've heard religious people say that SRHR advocacy is Western framed because they want to control our populations in Africa. And I'm like, oh, what a level of ignorance. And so I invite people to a decolonial aspect, to forget about the fact that we've been made to believe and conditioned that this is a Western agenda, and say, no, it's an African issue. It's an African agenda. Unless Africans are not human beings, Africans should not talk about SRHR. But because Africans are human beings, because Africans, and this I will be crucified for saying, because Africans are making babies, because Africans are having sex, because Africans are having sexual needs, because Africans are having reproductive needs, then it must be something that concerns us, that we do as Africans, that we do as Black people in this Black continent, into a decolonial approach, and not in the abstract sense, but in looking at Africans are human beings. Africans have needs, both sexual and reproductive, that needs to be catered for. And the last one that I would now bring to a close is, in many spaces, I've said this, we need to come from a perspective of lived reality. Let us not put our Bible or our religious text as the only thing we look at. Could we also look at lived realities? Could we bring people's experiences at par with the scripture, at par with our religious norms and religious texts and scripts? Lived reality makes us look at those texts differently. It opens our eyes to see a context that requires a progressive reading of those texts. So in short, intersectional approach, decolonial approach, and an approach that pays attention to lived realities of the people in Africa.
I agree with you, Adera, that paying attention to the lived realities of people promotes a progressive way of reading the scripture, which is why I think that the Intersectional C-Judge Act tool, the ISJA that was mentioned earlier, is a very, very key resource, especially in intersectionality in SRHR. So just to mention to our listeners what the Intersectional C-Judge Act tool is, it's an action-focused method of analyzing religious issues. So where you can find this resource and other tools that Makeway has on intersectionality is the website, which is www.make-way.org. Please visit this website and look at all the tools, and in particular the ISJA tool, which is very, very interesting and important. So thank you, Adera, and thank you, Vilda and Bertha, for joining me in this episode. And thank you so much, listeners, for listening through. I do hope that you are caught up in our previous episodes as well. We did have 2 episodes on intersectionality in SRHR with Jethro Piri, which we named Leave No One Behind. I hope you're caught up on those. And please look out for next episode on meaningful youth engagement, which will drop next week. You can find this podcast on YouTube, on Spotify, on Apple Podcasts, just by searching Make Way for Youth Podcast in the search bars of these platforms. Also, please support this podcast by sharing the links to particular episodes you like on your social media networks. We'll be very grateful to you for doing so. That's all for today. Thank you so much and see you next week. Bye.